So I have an exciting announcement with respect to space, and I think one which should be provide some inspiration and some belief that the innovation is alive and well in America and going in really interesting directions. But before I'm going to get to that, but I'm going to preface that with the logic that explains why such a thing is important, because it may not be immediately obvious. So first of all, going back to why am I in space and electric cars and solar power and internet stuff, it goes back to when I was in college and I was trying to think of what were the most important things that would affect the future of humanity. What could have a significant positive effect on the future of humanity? And the three things that I came up with were the internet, sustainable energy, both production and consumption, and then space exploration, but specifically making life multiplanetary. And I didn't expect when I was in college to actually be involved in all three of those areas, but as a result of some success in the internet arena, that gave me the capital to get involved in very high capital endeavors like cars and rockets, which really are very high capital. So the reason for I'm mostly going to talk about space. So I want to explain sort of why do I think space is really important, and what about space, and because I believe in sort of building things up from a rational sort of framework of logic, and so you start with sort of, well, how do you decide that anything is important? And I think the lens of history is a helpful guide here, in that things that may seem important in the moment, but actually aren't that important in the grand scheme. Over time, if you look at things over a broad span of time, the things that are less important kind of fall away. And if you look at things from the broadest possible span of time as it relates to life itself, and the evolution of life has been, primitive life, I think, started around 3.5 to 3.8 billion years ago. And what are the important steps in the evolution of life? And obviously there was the advent of single-celled life, there was differentiation to plants and animals, there was life going from the oceans to land, there was mammals, consciousness, and I would argue also on that scale should fit life becoming multiplanetary. And in fact, I think consciousness, it's the next step, actually, because you really kind of need consciousness to design vehicles that can transport life over hundreds of millions of miles of irradiated space to an environment that they did not evolve to exist in. It would be very convenient, of course, if there was another planet just like Earth nearby. But that's unlikely, and as it turns out, not the case. So I think you couldn't really. There's no way for life to sort of just by dint of natural selection just sort of get over to Mars and survive. So you need consciousness. You got to design. So I think it is the next natural step. So I think if one could make a reasonable argument that something is important enough to fit on the scale of evolution, then it's important, and maybe worth a little bit of our resources. And one can also think of it from the standpoint of life insurance. There's some chance, either as a result of something humanity does, or as a result of something natural like a giant asteroid hitting us or something, that civilization, life as we know it, could be destroyed. There's clear evidence for life being destroyed multiple times in the fossil record. So we don't need to guess that this is something that can occur. It has occurred. The Permian extinction being a particularly interesting one, because I think that destroyed somewhere between 90 and 95% of all species on Earth which doesn't tell the full story because most of the remaining species were fungi. So unless you're a mushroom, you're out of luck. So you know, if we think it's worth buying life insurance on an individual level, well, perhaps it's worth spending something on life insurance for life as we know it, and arguably that expenditure should be greater than zero. So then we can just get to the question of what is an appropriate expenditure for life insurance, and you know, I think probably if it's something like 0.25% of the GDP, that would be okay. I think most people would say, okay, that's not too bad. You know, it's but you know, you don't want it. You want it to be some sort of number that is much less than we spend on healthcare, but maybe more than we spend on lipstick. You know, something like that. And I like lipstick. It's not like I've got anything against it. Yeah, I can't wait for that comment to go out there. So that's kind of the thing that I think it's important that we give a little bit of our mind space towards. And I think it's also one of the most inspiring and interesting things that we could try to do. It's one of the greatest adventures that humanity could ever embark upon. And you know, life has to be more than about solving problems. You know, if all that life is about is solving problems, why bother getting up in the morning? There have to be things that inspire you to, you know, that make you proud to be a member of humanity. And you know, the Apollo program is certainly an example of that. It's only a handful of people went to the moon, and yet, actually, we all went to the moon. We went with them vicariously. We shared in that adventure. I don't think anyone would say that was a bad idea. That was great. So, you know, we need more of those things. Or at least we need some of those things. And you know, even if someone's in a completely different industry and in a completely different walk of life, it's still something that's going to make you feel good about the world. And that's another reason why I think we should try to do these great things. So now then let's get to the question of well, how do you make life multiplanetary? What are the fundamental obstacles to that? Because it's all well and good if everyone agrees that that's worth doing, but if we can't do it, well, it doesn't matter. So the pivotal breakthrough that's necessary, that some company has to come up with to make life multiplanetary is a fully and rapidly reusable orbit-class rocket. This is a very difficult thing to do because we live on a planet where that is just barely possible. If gravity were a little lower, it would be easy. If it was a little higher, it would be impossible. Even for an expendable launch vehicle, you know, where you don't attempt any recovery, after a lot of smart people have done their best to optimize the weight of the vehicle and the efficiency of the engines and the guidance system, everything, you get maybe 2 to 3% of your liftoff weight to orbit. That's not a lot of room for error. So if your rocket ends up being just a little bit heavier, you get nothing to orbit. And this is why only a few countries have ever reached orbit. Now you say, okay, well, let's make it reusable, which means you've got to strengthen the stages. You've got to add a lot of weight, a lot of thermal protection. You've got to do a lot of things that add weight to that vehicle and still have a useful payload to orbit. This is, now you're saying of that meager 2 to 3%, and maybe if you're really good, get it to 4%, you've got to add all that's necessary to bring the rocket stages back to the launch pad and be able to refly them and still have useful payload to orbit. So a very difficult thing. This has been attempted many times in the past, and generally what's happened is when people have concluded that success was not one of the possible outcomes, then the project's been abandoned. Well, in some government projects kept going even when success was not one of the possible outcomes, unfortunately. But then eventually they get canceled. So it's just a very tough engineering problem. And it wasn't something that I thought, I wasn't sure it could be solved for a while. But then I think just sort of relatively recently, probably just in the last 12 months or so, I've come to the conclusion that it can be solved. And I think SpaceX is going to try to do it. Now, we could fail. I'm not saying we're certain of success here, but we're going to try to do it. And we have a design that, on paper, doing the calculations, doing the simulations, it does work. And now we need to make sure that those simulations and reality agree, because generally when they don't, reality wins. So that's to be determined. And the simulation that you may have seen in the lobby coming in, which will be posted to our website right around now, will show you a simulation of what we plan to do. Now that simulation is mostly accurate, but there are a few areas which are inaccurate. In some cases, just due to timing constraints, we weren't able to work with the simulation people to get it completely accurate. And in some cases, we're keeping a few technical things under our hat. But it gives you a pretty good idea of what we intend to do, which is to land basically for the first stage, after stage separation, turn the stage around, relight the engines, boost back to the launch pad, and land propulsively on landing legs. And then with the upper stage, after dropping off the satellite or Dragon spacecraft, then do a deorbit burn, re-enter. You need quite a powerful heat shield. Steer aerodynamically back to the launch pad. You don't actually need wings, by the way. This is a common misperception to steer aerodynamically. You just need some lift over drag number and lift vector, and steer back to the launch pad. Then land propulsively with the upper stage, also with landing gear. So we'll see if this works, but it's going to be certainly an exciting journey. If it does work, it'll be pretty huge. Because if you look at, say, the cost of a Falcon 9 rocket, which is quite a big rocket, it's about 1 million pounds of thrust. It is the lowest cost rocket in the world, but even so, it's about $50 to $60 million. But the cost of the fuel and oxygen and so forth is only about $200,000. So obviously, if we can reuse the rocket, say 1,000 times, then that would make the capital cost of the rocket per launch only about $50,000. There'd be maintenance and other things that would factor in there, and fixed costs and some overhead allocation and whatnot. But it would allow for about 100-fold reduction in launch costs. And this is a pretty obvious thing if you think about it as applied to any other mode of transport. You can imagine that if planes were not reusable, very few people would fly. 747 is about $300 million. You'd need 2 of them for a round trip. And yet I don't think anyone here has paid $500 million to fly. And the reason is because those planes can be used tens of thousands of times, and so all you're really paying for is fuel and pilot costs and just sort of incidentals, and the capital cost is relatively small. So that's why it's such a giant difference. Or thought of another way, I mentioned that we could probably afford 0.25% of our GDP for making life multiplanetary. That's the cost if you have a fully reusable rocket. The cost if you don't have a fully reusable rocket on the same barometer would be 100% of the GDP. And that would mean no money for food, healthcare, or anything else. And obviously that's impossible. So that's why I think a fully and rapidly reusable system is fundamentally required for life to become multiplanetary, for us to establish life on Mars. Mars is the only realistic option for another planet. Venus being too hot, Mercury being way too hot, Jupiter being a gas giant, The moons of Jupiter are a possibility, but it's much further out and it's harder in a lot of different ways. And the moon is sort of too small and resource poor to make life multiplanetary. Emphasize not just to have a little base. A little base is not that interesting, but a self-sustaining human civilization is that's on multiple planets where life could continue even in the event of a calamity on Earth. That is the real thing. Yeah, so I think this is pretty exciting, and I think everyone in America and arguably the rest of the world should be pretty fired up about what we're doing, and hopefully wish us well, and we'll do our best to succeed in this regard. And yeah, it's definitely going to be an adventure. I'll say one final thing, which is that sometimes people say, well, what is the business model for Mars? And sometimes they think, well, can you mine Mars and bring things back? And that is not a realistic business model for Mars, because it's always going to be far cheaper to mine things on Earth than Mars. But I do think that there's a business model where if you can reduce the cost of a flight to Mars or moving to Mars to around the cost of a middle-class home in California, which these just seem to be rising over time, maybe not recently, but certainly pretty expensive. So maybe to around $500,000. Then I think you would have enough people would buy a ticket and move to Mars to be part of creating a new planet and be part of kind of the founding team of a new civilization. You don't have you don't obviously have to be willing to have quite an appetite for risk and adventure. But there's 7 billion people on Earth now. There'll be probably 8 billion by the midpoint of the century. So even if 1 in a million people decided to do that, that's still 8,000 people. And I think probably more than 1 in a million people will decide to do that. So that's what I think is sort of the Mars business model, if you will. And then ultimately Mars can probably export intellectual property like software and inventions and things like that. If you can sort of beam it back with photons, that's sort of the better way to go. All right, so I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much.
In sort of last fiscal year, it was about $300 million, but that was split over 4 companies. So we got about 75, I think, or something like that. So that's, I guess, about 0.5% of the NASA budget. So it's important to bear in mind that we'd love to hire a lot more people than we currently hire, but we can't run out of money and die.
Mm-hmm.
So we can only hire a few people. In terms of what characteristics we look for, we generally we're quite engineering centric. So we're big fans of what have people done from a hardcore engineering standpoint. What tough engineering problems have they solved? How they solve them? We're sort of less interested if it's sort of been more of a paper-oriented role that they've had, because we try to minimize that at SpaceX. So,
are you more demanding an employer than NASA would have been?
Well, that's a tough question to answer.
Give it a shot.
I think we're probably more demanding. I mean, I guess NASA is a large organization, so I think the level of demand that people face in different parts of NASA varies considerably. And I'm sure that there are parts of NASA which are just as demanding, maybe more demanding than SpaceX. But SpaceX is an extremely demanding organization, and we expect people to work super hard and be very good at their job. Boy, the climate debate is an interesting one. So if you ask any scientist, are you sure that human activity is causing global warming? Any scientist should say no, because you cannot be sure. So on the other hand, if you said, do you think we should put an arbitrary number of trillions of tons of CO2 into the atmosphere and just keep doing it until something bad happens, they'll probably say no too. We essentially are running an experiment, and that experiment is to test the carbon capacity of the oceans and atmosphere. Now, that experiment may turn out to be fine. It may also turn out to be really bad. And I just don't understand why we would run that experiment. Particularly when you consider that at some point we have to get to something that is sustainable. We have to have sustainable production of energy and consumption of energy. Because tautologically, if it's unsustainable, you will run out of it. And you can simply say, well, let's say hypothetically CO2 was good for the environment. And let's say hypothetically the United States possessed all the oil in the world. Well, you'd still have to get off oil because it's a finite resource. And as you start to run out of it, the scarcity would drive the cost up and cause economic collapse. So why not do it sooner? And I'm not saying that it needs to be a radical or immediate change, or that people need to now inject a great deal of misery into their lives to avoid CO2. But we should lean in that direction. We should lean in the direction of supporting technologies that are sustainable and lean slightly against technologies that are unsustainable. That just seems pretty sensible, even if environment isn't a factor. And in fact, my interest in electric vehicles predates the current climate issue. I mean, I was interested in electric vehicles sort of 20 years ago when nobody was really talking about global warming, because I just thought it was the obvious means of transport. But I do think the climate thing does add urgency to things, and I do think we will see quite a significant increase in the cost of oil. Just from a demographic standpoint, you've got China and India and a few other countries that represent almost half the world's population and have very few cars on the road, but are rapidly adding cars to the road. And so you can expect a doubling of demand, and I think it's going to be difficult to achieve a doubling of supply. Yeah, I mean, so in the case of Solyndra, Solyndra has obviously become somewhat of a political football here. Speaking of political footballs earlier, the DOE programs, they're necessarily our portfolio of programs where some number of the things that are funded there are going to fail. That should be assumed. You should not assume that a 100% success. And in the case of Solyndra, people forget that private investors lost twice as much as the government did. So it's not, and there were some really first-rate venture capitalists in Solyndra. It's not as though these were suckers. So if you've got first-rate venture capitalists who've lost twice as much money as the federal government, you have to say, okay, I mean, it was a bet. The bet didn't work, but that doesn't mean it's something really terrible happened. I mean, the most you could say is that Solyndra executives were too optimistic. They presented a better face to the situation than should have been presented in the final few months. But then, if they didn't do that, it would have become a self-fulfilling prophecy of as soon as the CEO says, "I'm not sure whether we'll survive," you're dead. So, I think people are making too much of the Solyndra thing. And do I think there are parallels with Tesla? I mean, we got a loan from the DOE from a different program, I should point out. But in our case, we have significant capital reserves, and we have more money at Tesla than we need to complete the program in question. And we don't face the same issue that Solyndra faced, which is extreme competition from China on a commodity product that drove the cost per watt of solar panels from $4 a watt down to $1. That's the fundamental reason why Solyndra went down. Is Solyndra would have been okay at $2 a watt, but not $1. And that's it. So and here's another thing which is not getting enough press, which is how much money do you think the Chinese government's put into solar? Estimates are about 40 billion, okay? So we've got our team with operating on a pittance. We've got China operating on 40 billion, and our team lost. That should be no surprise. It was something that I expected would occur. So if somebody had asked me, do you think Cylinder is a good investment, I would have said, no, you're going to get your ass kicked. So SolarCity works on balance of system, where they do everything except the panel. And they own the end customer relationship. They're kind of like Dell or Apple. You know, Dell or Apple don't make the CPU or the memory or the hard drives, but they design the overall system, and they provide it to customers. They do the sales and marketing service. And that's what SolarCity does. SolarCity is doing super well. And they're growing at 50 to 100% a year with positive cash flow, which is pretty incredible. I just show up at board meetings to hear the good news. It's really great. All credit to those guys. So, for them, the more rapacious the competition on solar panels, the better.
That helps you.
Yeah.